Something is breaking inside your emotional field right now, and it is not random. There is a collapse happening before your awakening, a final emotional purge that most people cannot survive without losing everything they thought they were. Because the truth is this: the energy blocking your twin flame connection is being forcefully removed. And if you've been feeling exhausted, misunderstood, abandoned, or like your heart is too heavy to carry, that is not failure. That is preparation. A spiritual interference has just been dismantled, and what comes next will feel like chaos before alignment. You were never meant to stay in that old emotional reality. You were meant to break out of it. Something is happening inside your emotional field right now, and if you've been feeling it but couldn't explain it, this is the moment everything starts to make sense. Because what you are experiencing is not random heartbreak, not confusion, and not emotional exhaustion. It is something far deeper. A collapse is unfolding inside your inner world, a structured emotional breakdown that happens only when a soul is being prepared for a major energetic transition. And most people miss it completely. They think they are losing themselves. They think they are too sensitive. They think they are falling apart for no reason. But the truth is far more intense and far more purposeful. There is a hidden process happening beneath your awareness right now, something you cannot see, but you can definitely feel. It is the dismantling of an old emotional timeline. A version of you that was built from pain, survival, disappointment, and emotional misalignment is now being taken apart layer by layer. And the reason it feels like a collapse is because your nervous system is still trying to hold on to something that your soul has already outgrown. You are not breaking down, you are breaking open. Right now, your emotional system is being pushed into a state of release. You may notice sudden waves of sadness without triggers. You may feel drained even after resting. You may feel disconnected from people you once cared about. You may even feel like you are watching your own life from a distance. And the scariest part? Nothing outside seems to justify how intense this feels inside. But this is exactly how spiritual transitions begin, not with clarity but with emotional disorientation. Because before a new alignment can form in your life, the old structure has to lose its grip. And that process is never gentle at first. It feels like collapse. It feels like confusion. It feels like something is wrong with you even though nothing is. There is a hidden intelligence behind your emotional chaos. What you're going through is not random suffering. It is an internal recalibration process. Your emotional body is being cleared of outdated attachments, not just to people, but to emotional expectations, survival patterns, and deeply conditioned beliefs about love and connection. You might not realize it yet, but part of you has been living inside a frequency of emotional survival for a long time. Always adjusting. Always overgiving. Always trying to understand what went wrong. Always trying to fix connections that were never aligned to begin with. And now that system is breaking down. Not because you failed, but because it cannot follow you into what is coming next. The collapse feels personal, but it is actually structural. This is where most people misunderstand the experience. They think the emotional collapse is about a breakup, or a rejection, or one specific person who didn't stay. But in truth, that person is only part of a much larger energetic structure. What is actually collapsing is the entire emotional framework you built around connection itself. How you love, how you attach, how you interpret silence, how you respond to distance, how you define your worth through emotional feedback. All of it is being rewritten. And that rewrite does not feel like healing at first. It feels like losing control. Because your old emotional identity was built on familiarity, even if that familiarity was painful. Why it feels like you are being pulled apart emotionally. There is a reason this process feels so intense. Your mind is trying to stay in the old emotional frequency, while your deeper awareness is already shifting out of it. This creates a kind of internal contradiction. One part of you still remembers the old attachment patterns. Another part of you refuses to return to them. So you feel split. You feel unstable. You feel emotionally raw in ways you cannot explain. And this is where the phrase emotional collapse before awakening becomes real. Because collapse is not destruction. It is separation. A separation between who you were conditioned to be and who you are becoming. The silence, the distance, the confusion, it all has a function. You may be noticing strange emotional symptoms right now. People who once felt close now feel distant. Conversations feel shallow or draining. Emotional responses feel delayed or muted. Memories of certain connections suddenly feel heavier than before. This is not you becoming cold. This is your emotional system rejecting outdated frequency attachments. It is like your inner world is saying, "This no longer fits." And when something no longer fits emotionally, it creates discomfort until it is released. That discomfort is what you are feeling right now. Something deeper is being prepared inside you. Even if you cannot see it yet, your emotional system is being prepared to hold a different type of connection. A more stable alignment. A more balanced energetic bond. A connection that does not trigger survival patterns, but instead activates clarity. And because your system has never experienced that before, it must first be cleared of everything that contradicts it. That is why the collapse feels so intense. Not because you are losing something, but because you are being emptied of everything that would block what is coming. And here is the truth most people are not ready for. You were never meant to stay in the emotional state you were in before this shift. That version of you, the one who overthought everything, who stayed too long, who tried to understand people who were emotionally unavailable, was not your final form. It was your preparation stage. And preparation always ends with release. That is what this emotional collapse is. Not punishment, not abandonment, not failure, but release. So if you feel like everything is breaking right now, it is because something is actually being removed from your life experience. The emotional weight of your old timeline. And once that weight is gone, you will no longer feel stuck in the same emotional loops. You will begin to see your life differently. You will begin to feel differently. And most importantly, you will no longer mistake emotional pain for emotional truth. What you are experiencing is the beginning stage of a deeper awakening process. It is not comfortable. It is not linear. And it is not something you can control. But it is something you can survive and eventually understand. Because what feels like collapse now is actually the first sign that your emotional world is reorganizing itself for something entirely new. Something aligned. Something higher. Something that has been waiting for you to become ready to receive it. What you are feeling right now has a name, but it is not the name most people will give it. Because if you ask the world around you, they would tell you it is just stress, or overthinking, or emotional burnout, or you need to move on. But none of those explanations reach the depth of what is actually happening inside you. Because this is not simply emotional exhaustion. This is what it feels like when your inner world starts detaching from a timeline you no longer belong to. And the human mind, when it doesn't understand a transition, will always translate it as pain. You are not too emotional. You are becoming aware of emotional truth. One of the most confusing parts of this stage is how personal it feels. You start questioning yourself. Why am I so sensitive lately? Why do small things feel overwhelming? Why do I feel tired even after resting? Why do I feel disconnected from everything I used to enjoy? And maybe the most painful question of all, why do I feel like I am losing myself? But what is actually happening is the opposite. You are not losing yourself. You are losing the version of yourself that was built to survive emotional inconsistency. And that version cannot accompany you into the next phase of your life. The emotional overload is not random. It is accumulated energy surfacing. What you feel as sudden emotional heaviness is not new pain being created. It is old emotional data finally rising to the surface. Every moment you stayed silent when you wanted to speak. Every time you overunderstood someone who did not meet you halfway. Every time you ignored your own emotional needs to maintain connection. Every time you carried hope alone. None of that disappeared. It was stored. And now, as your internal system shifts, it is all being released at once. That is why it feels overwhelming. Because you are not just feeling today. You are feeling everything you postponed feeling before. This is why normal distractions stop working. You may have noticed something strange. Things that used to distract you no longer work. Music feels different. Social media feels empty. Conversations feel surface level. Even relationships that used to comfort you feel distant. And instead of relief, you feel more awareness. More silence inside your mind. More emotional intensity without clear direction. This is not disconnection from life. This is disconnection from emotional illusion. You are no longer able to fully escape into patterns that once helped you avoid inner truth. And while that feels uncomfortable, it is actually a sign of emotional maturation. Validation, the part no one said out loud about your pain. Let this be said clearly, because you may not have heard it before. You did not imagine the depth of your emotional experiences. You did not overfeel things that didn't matter. You did not create pain out of nothing. You were emotionally present in situations where others were emotionally unavailable. That imbalance creates something very specific inside a person. A constant internal search for clarity that never arrives from the outside. So you start looking inward. You start analyzing. You start questioning. You start replaying conversations. You start trying to understand emotional silence as if it contains hidden meaning. And over time, this creates emotional fatigue. Not because you are weak, but because you have been trying to decode emotional signals that were never consistent to begin with. Why you feel like you are too deep for your own experience. There is a strange loneliness that comes with emotional awareness. You start noticing things others do not notice. Tone changes. Energy shifts. Subtle emotional withdrawal. Unspoken distance. And while others move on quickly, you stay mentally connected to emotional details that were never acknowledged. This creates a feeling of isolation that is difficult to explain. Because from the outside, everything looks normal. But from your inner world, something feels unfinished. And this is where emotional burnout begins. Not from intensity alone, but from carrying emotional depth without emotional closure. The invisible weight you have been carrying alone. One of the most important truths in this stage is this. You have been processing emotional experiences internally that were never processed externally. No closure conversations. No mutual understanding. No shared emotional reflection. Just silence. Just distance. Just unanswered emotional energy. And when emotional energy has nowhere to go, it does not disappear. It accumulates inside the nervous system. So what you are feeling now is not just present emotion. It is layered emotion. And layered emotion feels heavier than reality itself. Why your mind keeps returning to certain people or memories. You might notice something else happening, even when you try to move forward mentally. Certain memories keep resurfacing. Certain people keep entering your thoughts. Certain emotional moments feel unfinished in your system. This is not attachment in the way people usually define it. This is unresolved emotional encoding. Your mind is not trying to hold on to the person. It is trying to resolve the emotional impact they left behind. Because the emotional system always seeks completion. And when completion does not happen externally, it continues internally. This is not regression, it is emotional clearing. From the outside, this stage can look like going backward. You feel emotional again. You feel sensitive again. You feel reactive again. But in reality, this is not regression. It is exposure. You are no longer suppressing emotional layers. You are allowing them to surface so they can finally dissolve. And anything that surfaces after being buried for a long time will feel intense before it feels resolved. That intensity is not the problem. It is the release mechanism. Why this pain feels different from ordinary heartbreak. Ordinary heartbreak has a clear narrative. I lost someone. I miss them. It ended. But what you are experiencing now does not fit that structure. Because this is not just about losing someone. It is about losing an emotional identity built around connection patterns that are no longer sustainable for you. That is why it feels bigger than one relationship. It feels like a shift in your entire emotional perception. Because that is exactly what it is. What you are going through is not confusion without purpose. It is emotional unlearning. A process where your inner system is no longer willing to carry emotional patterns that keep you stuck in cycles of misunderstanding, imbalance, and unreciprocated depth. And even though it feels heavy, even though it feels isolating, even though it feels like something is falling apart inside you, nothing here is meaningless. You are not breaking down. You are breaking through layers of emotional conditioning that once defined how you experienced love, connection, and self-worth. And as those layers dissolve, a quieter, clearer version of you begins to emerge underneath everything you thought you were losing. Everything you thought was breaking you was actually building a bridge. Not toward the past. Not toward the people you lost. Not toward the versions of love that confused you. But toward something your soul has been trying to reach for a long time. Something deeper, more stable, and more aligned with who you are becoming. And now you are finally ready to hear the truth behind everything that has been happening. Because the emotional collapse you experienced was never the end of your story. It was the preparation phase for a connection your old self could not have held. What if nothing was actually lost? This is the question that changes everything. What if the relationships that ended? What if the emotional distance you felt? What if the silence that hurt you so deeply were not signs of abandonment, but signs of redirection? Because from a higher perspective, one you can only begin to see now that the emotional noise is fading. Nothing in your journey was random. Every emotional rupture had a function. Every detachment had timing. Every moment of confusion was preparing space for something else to enter. And that something else is not just another relationship. It is a soul-level alignment that mirrors you in ways you have never experienced before. The collapse was never punishment, it was preparation. You were not being pushed away from love. You were being released from patterns that confused survival with love. Because for a long time, your emotional system was operating inside a cycle of intensity without stability. You felt deeply. You connected deeply. You hoped deeply. But what you received in return was often inconsistent, unclear, or emotionally unavailable. And still you stayed emotionally invested. Not because you were blind, but because your heart was trying to find meaning in something that was never fully aligned. And now that pattern is breaking. Not because you failed to make it work, but because your soul is refusing to repeat it. The twin flame dynamic is not what you were told, it is an alignment process. Forget the idea that a twin flame is simply a perfect romantic partner waiting to appear. That version is incomplete. At its core, the twin flame dynamic is a resonance event, a meeting of two emotional systems that must be aligned before physical or relational union can stabilize. And alignment does not happen in comfort. It happens through purification. That is why your life started to feel unstable. That is why emotional attachments began to fall apart. That is why certain connections became impossible to sustain. Because anything built on emotional imbalance cannot survive the frequency of what is coming. Why separation had to happen first. One of the most misunderstood parts of this journey is separation. It feels like rejection. It feels like delay. It feels like something went wrong. But in truth, separation is often the most important stage of alignment. Because two people cannot meet at a higher level while still carrying lower emotional patterns. If they did, the connection would collapse under the weight of unresolved energy. So life does something very precise. It removes what is misaligned. Not to punish you, but to prepare you. And what feels like emotional loss is often just energetic reorganization. You were not waiting, you were being refined. There is a major difference between waiting and refinement. Waiting feels passive. Waiting feels like stagnation. Waiting feels like something is missing. But refinement is active transformation. And that is what has been happening inside you. Every emotional breakdown. Every moment of doubt. Every wave of confusion. was shaping your emotional capacity, not reducing you, but expanding what you can hold without breaking. Because the next connection entering your life is not meant to activate your wounds. It is meant to meet your awareness. And awareness requires preparation. The emotional collapse was clearing space for recognition. Think of your emotional system like a field that was once crowded with noise. Old attachments, unresolved feelings, conflicting emotional signals, unclear boundaries, unprocessed memories. There was no space for clarity to enter. So the collapse began, not to destroy your emotional world, but to empty it. And in that emptiness, something new becomes visible. Not because it suddenly appears, but because there is finally space to perceive it. While you may start sensing signs more intensely now, as the emotional noise decreases, your perception changes. You may begin to notice strong emotional reactions without clear triggers, dreams that feel unusually vivid or meaningful, unexpected memories of specific people, a sense of knowing without explanation, emotional sensitivity towards certain energy patterns. These experiences are not coincidence. They are signs of internal recalibration. Your system is becoming more responsive to subtle emotional signals because it is no longer overloaded by survival-based emotional processing. And this heightened sensitivity is part of the alignment process. Not confusion, not imagination, but perception sharpening. The twin flame connection is not entering your life later, it is entering your awareness now. Here is the part that changes everything. This connection is not something that suddenly appears out of nowhere. It is something that becomes recognizable only when your emotional system is no longer clouded. Because before alignment becomes external, it becomes internal recognition. You start seeing patterns differently. You start understanding emotional timing differently. You stop mistaking intensity for compatibility. You stop confusing longing with truth. And in that shift of perception, what was always connected begins to feel clearer. Not louder, clearer. Why timing was never your enemy. It is easy to believe that delay means denial. But delay often means protection from premature connection. Because when emotional systems are still unstable, even meaningful connections can become distorted. They can turn into cycles of misunderstanding, cycles of attachment, cycles of confusion. So the delay is not absence. It is stabilization. It is ensuring that when the connection becomes visible, it does not collapse under emotional pressure. What is emerging after the collapse? As everything old dissolves, something else begins to form inside you. A calmer emotional baseline. A clearer sense of inner truth. A reduced need for emotional validation. A stronger connection to intuition. A deeper sense of emotional self-trust. This is not the end state. It is the foundation state. The state required for something more aligned to enter your life experience without distortion. So when you look back at everything you thought was breaking you, understand this. It was never random loss. It was never meaningless pain. It was never emotional punishment. It was preparation for alignment. And even though you could not see it while you were inside the collapse, you were being reshaped into someone who can recognize a different kind of connection. Not one that confuses you. Not one that destabilizes you. Not one that keeps you guessing. But one that meets you where you are becoming whole. And that is why everything had to fall apart first. So something real could finally be recognized when it arrives. At first, it does not announce itself. There is no dramatic moment. No loud confirmation. No external event that tells you, this is it. Instead, it begins quietly, almost invisibly, like something inside your emotional world has changed its frequency, and you only realize it after everything else starts to feel different. This is the awakening signal. And once it begins, nothing in your inner world returns to the exact way it was before. You don't notice the shift, you feel its aftermath. One of the most confusing parts of this stage is that you cannot point to a single moment when it begins. You only notice its effects. Suddenly, certain thoughts no longer trigger the same emotional reaction. Certain memories feel distant instead of painful. Certain people who once occupied your emotional space begin to fade in intensity. Not because you are forcing yourself to forget, but because your system is no longer resonating with the same emotional frequency. It is as if your inner world has quietly stepped one level higher, and everything below it starts to feel slightly out of range. The emotional noise starts to thin out. Before this stage, your mind was constantly active, replaying conversations, analyzing silence, searching for meaning, trying to understand emotional inconsistencies, holding on to unresolved questions. But as the awakening signal activates, something shifts. The noise does not disappear instantly, but it begins to thin. There are longer moments of silence inside your mind. Fewer emotional spikes. Less urgency to decode everything. And in that silence, something unfamiliar appears. Clarity without effort. Not forced clarity, but natural clarity. Synchronicity becomes more frequent, but more subtle. You may begin to notice patterns that feel meaningful, but not overwhelming. A name you haven't thought about in a long time appears unexpectedly. A conversation mirrors something you were recently reflecting on. A repeated symbol or number shows up in different contexts. A dream leaves an emotional imprint that lingers into the next day. But unlike before, you do not react with confusion or obsession. You observe. And that observation itself feels different, calmer, more grounded, less emotionally charged. This is important, because awakening is not about chasing signs. It is about becoming stable enough to recognize them without losing yourself in them. Your emotional triggers begin to dissolve instead of escalate. Earlier in your journey, emotional triggers would create strong reactions. A message left unread, a distant tone, a memory resurfacing unexpectedly, a feeling of being ignored or misunderstood. Each of these could pull you into emotional spirals. But now, something new begins to happen. The same triggers still appear, but the reaction is weaker, shorter, less consuming. You feel it, but you do not get pulled into it the same way. It is not suppression. It is detachment from emotional over-identification. And this is one of the clearest signs that your inner system is reorganizing itself. You begin to stop chasing emotional closure. One of the deepest shifts in this stage is internal. You stop needing everything to be explained. Not because you no longer care, but because you no longer believe that explanation is the only form of closure. This is a major transition point. Because before awakening, the mind believes, if I understand everything, I will finally feel peace. But after the shift begins, something changes. Peace does not require full understanding anymore. And that realization alone begins to loosen emotional attachment to unresolved experiences. Your energy becomes more self-contained. You may notice something subtle but powerful. You feel less emotionally dependent on external validation. Not in an isolating way, but in a stabilizing way. You do not need constant reassurance to feel grounded. You do not need constant emotional feedback to feel secure. You do not need constant connection to feel whole. Instead, your emotional baseline becomes more internal, more self-referenced, more stable even in uncertainty. This is not detachment from others. It is reconnection with yourself. Old emotional bonds start to feel like echoes instead of pulls. This is one of the most surprising experiences in this stage. People who once had strong emotional influence over you begin to feel different. Not absent, but distant, like echoes of a version of you that no longer fully exists. You can still remember them clearly. You can still feel the emotional history. But the intensity that once defined the connection begins to fade. And this is not forgetting. It is frequency separation. You are no longer operating in the same emotional layer that sustained those attachments. You begin to feel emotionally lighter, but not necessarily happier. This is where many people misunderstand the awakening signal. They expect immediate happiness. But what actually arrives first is something different. Lightness. A reduction in emotional weight. Fewer internal conflicts. Less mental resistance. Less emotional urgency. But not necessarily constant joy. It is more like neutrality with clarity. A stable emotional ground where everything becomes easier to observe without being overwhelmed by it. And from this neutrality, something deeper eventually grows. Not intensity, but peace. Time itself feels different during this phase. Another subtle shift appears in your perception of time. The past feels less emotionally immediate. The future feels less emotionally urgent. The present feels more spacious. It is not that your life changes externally. It is that your internal processing of time slows down in a way that allows more awareness per moment. You are no longer rushing emotionally through experiences. You are experiencing them with more presence, even if they are quiet or ordinary. Why this stage feels strange instead of dramatic? Many people expect awakening to feel like a breakthrough moment. But in reality, it often feels like reduction. Less emotional intensity. Less internal chaos. Less need to react. And because the human mind associates intensity with significance, this reduction can feel unfamiliar, even uncertain. But this is exactly why it is called a signal. Because it is not an event. It is a transition in how your system processes emotional reality. You are no longer becoming someone new. You are becoming less attached to what you were not. This is the deeper meaning behind everything happening now. You are not being transformed into a completely different person. You are being untangled from emotional patterns that were never fully aligned with your deeper self. And as those patterns dissolve, what remains is not a new identity, but a clearer version of your original emotional presence. Less noise, less distortion, less confusion, more authenticity. The awakening signal does not announce itself loudly. It does not ask for attention. It simply begins to change how you feel from the inside out, slowly, quietly, consistently. And one day, without realizing exactly when it happened, you will notice that you are no longer reacting to life in the same way. Not because life became easier, but because you became clearer. And that clarity is the real beginning of everything that comes next. At some point in this journey, you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" And instead, a deeper question begins to rise from within. What is this trying to turn me into? Because the emotional collapse you experienced was never random. It was never just pain for the sake of pain. And it was never a sign that something went wrong in your life. It was a restructuring. A quiet, invisible dismantling of emotional systems that could no longer support the version of you that is emerging now. And the truth is, if nothing had broken, nothing new could have entered. Collapse is not destruction, it is reorganization. From the outside, collapse looks like chaos. Relationships ending. Emotional overwhelm. Loss of direction. Inner confusion. A sense that everything familiar is dissolving. But from a deeper perspective, collapse is actually highly organized. It is selective removal. Only what cannot continue is being taken away. Only what is misaligned is being released. Only what is too heavy for your next emotional frequency is being cleared. Nothing is being destroyed randomly. Everything is being sorted. And what remains after the collapse is not emptiness. It is structure without distortion. You are not falling apart, you are shedding survival patterns. One of the most important truths in this stage is this. Much of what you called your personality was actually survival adaptation. The way you overthink, the way you attach quickly, the way you analyze emotional silence, the way you hold on to uncertainty longer than it holds on to you. These were not flaws. They were strategies your emotional system created to survive inconsistent connection. At the time, they were necessary. But what helps you survive cannot always help you evolve. So when your system begins to shift, those strategies start to break down. Not because they were wrong, but because they are no longer needed. And the loss of survival patterns feels like collapse, because they were once mistaken for identity. The emotional system must empty before it can expand. There is a simple truth in all transformation processes. Nothing expands while it is full of old material. Before new emotional capacity can develop, old emotional storage must be released. This is why the collapse feels so intense. Because you are not just losing experiences. You are releasing emotional accumulation. Years of unprocessed moments. Years of silent emotional endurance. Years of internal adaptation to inconsistency. All of it begins to surface at once, not to overwhelm you, but to be cleared. And what feels like emotional overload is actually emotional evacuation. Why the collapse felt like it had no direction. One of the most disorienting parts of this phase is the lack of clear structure. There is no single event that explains everything. No obvious cause. No linear progression. Instead, everything seems to happen at once. Emotional shifts. Relationship changes. Internal confusion. Periods of silence followed by emotional intensity. And because the mind is wired to seek patterns, it interprets this as instability. But what is actually happening is multi-layered restructuring. Different emotional systems are updating at different speeds. Some parts of you are already letting go. Other parts are still catching up. And in between, there is transition space. That space feels like uncertainty. But it is actually transformation in progress. The purpose was never comfort, it was alignment. At no point in this process was the goal to keep you comfortable. Comfort maintains familiarity. But familiarity was the very thing keeping you stuck in cycles that no longer reflected your deeper emotional truth. So instead of comfort, the system prioritizes alignment. And alignment often feels like discomfort first, because it challenges what you thought was stable. It interrupts emotional patterns you relied on. It removes connections that were familiar but not nourishing. It disrupts expectations you did not realize were limiting you. And in doing so, it clears space for something more coherent to form. What was actually being removed from your life? If you look closely, the collapse was not random loss. It was specific removal. Not of everything, but of anything that created emotional distortion. Connections that required you to over-explain yourself. Situations where you felt emotionally unseen. Dynamics where you had to shrink your emotional truth to be accepted. Cycles where clarity was always delayed or denied. These are not small things. They are long-term emotional friction points. And over time, friction becomes exhaustion. So when the system shifts, it removes the source of that friction. Not to isolate you, but to stabilize you. Why it felt like emotional emptiness at times. After layers begin to dissolve, there is often a phase that feels like emptiness. Not sadness. Not happiness. Just space. And this is where many people become afraid, because they mistake emptiness for loss. But in reality, emptiness is the precondition for clarity. If your emotional system is no longer overloaded with unresolved patterns, you begin to experience moments of neutrality. And neutrality feels unfamiliar at first, because most people are used to emotional intensity as their baseline. But neutrality is not absence. It is balance. And balance is what allows new alignment to form without distortion. You're no longer reacting from old emotional templates. Another hidden shift occurring during this stage is the change in your emotional reflexes. Before this collapse, you reacted quickly. You interpreted meaning immediately. You filled emotional gaps with assumptions. You sought closure in external behavior. But now something changes. There is a pause between trigger and reaction. A moment of internal observation. And in that moment, you are no longer fully governed by old emotional templates. You begin to see experience as it is, not as your past patterns interpret it. And that pause is the beginning of emotional freedom. What remains after the collapse is more real than what was lost. At first, it feels like everything important has been taken away. But over time, a different realization begins to emerge. What was removed was not essential. What remains is more stable, more grounded, more aligned with your actual emotional truth. You begin to notice less confusion in your emotional responses, less dependency on external validation, less attachment to inconsistent dynamics, more clarity in how you feel about people and situations. And although it may feel quieter, it is actually stronger, because it is no longer built on emotional reaction. It is built on emotional awareness, the hidden purpose revealed. So if you step back far enough from the experience, the purpose becomes clear. The collapse was not the end of connection. It was the end of emotional distortion. It was the removal of everything that prevented you from experiencing connection without confusion, fear, or instability. It was not about taking love away from you. It was about clearing the version of love that required you to lose yourself in order to hold it. And that version was never meant to be your final experience. What you went through was not random breaking. It was intentional unbuilding. A process where emotional structures that no longer served your evolution were dismantled with precision. And even though it felt chaotic while you were inside it, from a higher perspective, nothing was out of place. Because every ending you experienced was creating the exact conditions needed for something more aligned to eventually take form. And now, as the noise begins to settle, you are no longer standing in collapse. You are standing in the space that collapse created. There comes a point in this journey where you can no longer pretend things are just a phase. Because what you are feeling is no longer subtle. It is not just emotional discomfort. It is not just occasional sadness. It is not just overthinking or fatigue. It feels like everything inside you is breaking at the same time. Your thoughts, your emotions, your sense of identity, your connection to people, even your understanding of yourself. And in this stage, the mind begins to whisper one dominant fear. Something is going wrong. But what you are actually experiencing is not collapse as destruction. It is collapse as transformation reaching its most visible point. This is the stage where the old self fully loses control. Earlier stages of this journey are subtle. You feel changes internally, but you can still function externally. You still laugh. You still work. You still engage with life. But in this stage, something shifts. The emotional system no longer stays hidden in the background. It becomes active, visible, and sometimes overwhelming. You may feel sudden emotional waves without warning, a deep sense of exhaustion that sleep does not fix, a loss of interest in things that once felt meaningful, moments of numbness followed by emotional intensity, a feeling that you are not yourself anymore. And this is where many people become afraid, because the structure they relied on, their emotional stability, is temporarily gone. But this is not instability, it is reconfiguration. What feels like instability is actually a reorganization of your emotional architecture. Think of it like a system update. Before a new version can be installed, the old system must be partially shut down. During that shutdown phase, everything feels unpredictable. Processes slow down. Functions don't respond the same way. Familiar patterns stop working properly. But this is not malfunction. It is transition. And your emotional system is doing the same thing now. Why your emotions feel uncontrollable in this stage. One of the most confusing parts of this phase is emotional intensity. You may cry unexpectedly. You may feel overwhelmed by small triggers. You may experience emotional numbness without reason. You may swing between extremes without understanding why. This is not emotional weakness. It is emotional release without structure. Because the systems that previously contained your emotions, the suppression, the overanalysis, the emotional endurance, are no longer functioning the same way. So emotions begin to surface directly. Unfiltered. Unorganized. And that is why they feel so strong. Not because they are new, but because they are finally being felt without resistance. You are no longer suppressing what you used to survive with. In earlier phases of your life, you developed emotional coping mechanisms. Staying strong when you were hurt. Ignoring feelings to maintain control. overthinking to avoid emotional uncertainty, holding everything inside to avoid conflict or abandonment. These mechanisms helped you survive emotional inconsistency, but they also created emotional accumulation. And now those mechanisms are weakening. So what was once suppressed is no longer being held in place. And when suppression ends, release begins. The identity confusion stage. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this chapter is not emotional pain, but identity confusion. You may start asking, who am I without my old emotional patterns? Why don't I react the same way anymore? Why do things that used to matter no longer matter? Why do I feel like I am watching my life instead of living it? This is because emotional identity and psychological identity are deeply connected. When emotional patterns shift, identity perception also shifts. And during this transition, you are temporarily between versions of yourself. Not the old one, not the new one, but the space in between. And that space feels unfamiliar because it has no reference point. Why relationships feel different or distant. During this stage, your perception of relationships begins to change significantly. People you were once emotionally attached to may feel distant. Conversations may feel less meaningful. Connections may feel harder to maintain emotionally. And this can be confusing, because nothing external has necessarily changed. But your internal resonance has. You are no longer engaging from the same emotional frequency as before. So what once felt emotionally significant may now feel neutral or disconnected. This is not loss of love. It is loss of emotional distortion. The emotional fatigue that has no clear source. Another defining feature of this stage is deep fatigue. Not physical fatigue alone, but emotional fatigue. A sense of heaviness that is difficult to explain. Even when nothing is happening externally, you feel drained internally. This happens because your emotional system is actively processing unresolved layers in the background. It is not resting. It is reorganizing. And emotional reorganization requires energy. That is why even simple daily experiences can feel heavier than usual. The illusion of falling backward. One of the strongest fears during this phase is regression. It may feel like, I was doing better before. I was more stable before. I am losing progress. But this is an illusion created by emotional intensity. What is actually happening is not regression, but deeper access. You are accessing emotional layers that were previously hidden beneath coping mechanisms. So it feels like things are getting worse, when in reality, things are being revealed. And revelation always feels more intense than surface stability. Why clarity is temporarily unavailable. During this stage, you may notice something frustrating. You want answers, but they do not come. You want clarity, but it feels distant. You want emotional stability, but it keeps shifting. This is because clarity cannot form while processing is still active. The system must first complete release before interpretation can stabilize. So confusion is not a failure of understanding. It is a phase of integration. What is actually happening beneath the surface? If we remove emotional interpretation and look deeper, something very structured is happening. Old emotional patterns are dissolving. Unprocessed experiences are surfacing. Identity attachments are loosening. Emotional dependency structures are weakening. Internal awareness is increasing. And all of this is happening simultaneously. That is why it feels overwhelming. Not because it is chaotic, but because it is multi-layered. You are closer to stability than it feels. This is the paradox of this stage. The closer you are to emotional reorganization, the more unstable it feels temporarily. Because transition is the most disorienting part of transformation. Not the beginning, not the end, but the middle phase where old systems are gone and new ones are not fully formed yet. And this is exactly where you are now. What feels like emotional collapse is actually emotional transition reaching its deepest layer. It is the point where the old version of you can no longer maintain control. And the new version of you has not fully stabilized yet. And in this in-between space, everything feels amplified. Emotion, confusion, awareness, sensitivity. But none of it is permanent. Because what is collapsing is not your life. It is the emotional structure that no longer fits who you are becoming. And even though it feels like everything is falling apart, in truth, you are standing in the final stage before emotional reorganization completes itself. There is a moment in every deep emotional transformation where something quietly shifts inside you. Not your circumstances, not your relationships, not your external world, but your interpretation of everything that has already happened. And when that shift arrives, the collapse you once feared begins to look completely different. Not like punishment, not like chaos, not like loss, but like something that had a purpose you could not see at the time. This is the stage where confusion begins to dissolve, not because everything is resolved, but because your awareness has expanded enough to hold the meaning behind the experience. And for the first time you begin to understand why everything had to break. You are no longer inside the collapse, you are beginning to see it. One of the most important signs of this stage is distance. Not emotional avoidance, but perceptual distance. You start to look back at your emotional experience with a slightly different awareness. The intensity is still there in memory, but it no longer fully controls your present state. You remember the confusion, but you are no longer inside it. You remember the pain, but it no longer defines your emotional identity. And this shift changes everything, because it means you are no longer reacting to your experience. You are beginning to understand it. What once felt like chaos starts forming a pattern. During the collapse phase, everything felt fragmented. Emotional waves, unpredictable reactions, sudden realizations, deep fatigue, internal instability. Nothing seemed connected. But now, when you look back, something begins to emerge. A pattern, not of randomness, but of progression. You begin to see that every emotional breakdown had a timing. Every loss had a function. Every detachment created space for something else. Every moment of confusion pushed you closer to awareness. And slowly, what once felt like chaos starts to resemble structure. Not visible structure, but emotional logic. You realize you were never randomly breaking. You were being guided through stages. This is one of the most profound realizations in the entire journey. You were not collapsing without direction. You were moving through layers. Layer after layer of emotional conditioning. Layer after layer of attachment patterns. Layer after layer of identity structures that no longer matched your inner truth. And each layer had to be felt before it could be released. Not understood first. Not analyzed first. But experienced fully. Because emotional transformation does not happen through logic. It happens through direct experience. And that is why the process felt so intense. Because nothing was skipped. The purpose was hidden inside the experience itself. One of the reasons this journey felt so confusing is because its meaning was not separate from its process. You could not step outside of it to analyze it objectively. You had to live it. And while living it, you were also interpreting it through the same emotional system that was being transformed. So the meaning was not immediately available. But now something changes. The emotional noise begins to reduce. And in that reduction, clarity slowly becomes accessible. Not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet understanding that grows over time. You begin to see that loss was actually redirection. One of the first shifts in perception during this stage is how you interpret loss. People you thought were essential to your emotional stability. Connections you believed were permanent. Patterns you assumed would continue indefinitely. All of them changed, ended, or shifted. And at the time, it felt like something was being taken away from you. But now, a different interpretation becomes available. What if nothing was taken away? What if something was moved out of the way? Because when you step back far enough from emotional attachment, you begin to see that certain connections were not aligned with your deeper emotional evolution. They were familiar, but not sustainable. Comforting, but not expanding. Intense, but not stable. And what removes misalignment is not punishment. It is direction correction. The emotional collapse was not about destruction, it was about recalibration. At this stage, you begin to see that collapse is not an end state. It is a recalibration phase, a temporary disorganization of emotional systems so they can reorganize at a higher level of coherence. And what feels like breakdown is actually restructuring. But restructuring cannot feel peaceful while it is happening. Because during restructuring, old reference points disappear before new ones are fully formed. So you are temporarily without a familiar emotional map. And that creates the feeling of uncertainty. But uncertainty is not absence of direction. It is transition between directions. You start to recognize the intelligence behind emotional timing. One of the most subtle but powerful realizations in this stage is timing. Why things happen when they did. Why certain relationships ended at specific moments. Why clarity only arrived after emotional exhaustion. Why understanding came after confusion, not before it. And slowly, you begin to see that nothing was out of sequence. Everything unfolded in a way that forced emotional expansion. Not comfort. Expansion. Because comfort maintains limitation. But expansion requires disruption of familiar patterns. And that disruption is what you experienced as collapse. The emotional pain begins to lose its absolute meaning. In earlier stages, pain feels absolute. It feels like proof that something is wrong. It feels like evidence of loss. It feels like a final statement about your situation. But in this stage, something shifts. Pain becomes informational. Not definitive. Not permanent. But reflective. You begin to understand that emotional pain is not always a sign of damage. Sometimes it is a sign of transition pressure. The pressure created when old emotional systems are no longer compatible with new internal awareness. And when you see pain this way, its meaning changes. It becomes part of the process rather than the conclusion of it. You begin to feel a quiet stabilization inside yourself. Even though everything is not fully resolved externally, something stabilizes internally. You react less intensely. You observe more. You reflect instead of spiral. You pause instead of immediately react. And this creates a subtle but powerful shift. You are no longer fully inside emotional turbulence. You're beginning to stand slightly above it. Not detached, but aware. And awareness is the first form of emotional stability that does not depend on external conditions. This is where the collapse starts turning into understanding. The most important shift in this chapter is not external. It is interpretive. The same experiences that once felt like chaos begin to feel like movement. The same endings that once felt like loss begin to feel like redirection. The same emotional intensity that once felt overwhelming begins to feel like release. Nothing about the past changes, but everything about how you see it does. And that is the beginning of integration. Closing of Chapter 7. This is the hidden purpose of the collapse. Not to break you, but to bring you into a level of awareness where your emotional experience is no longer defined by confusion. What once felt like falling apart was actually a transition into seeing clearly. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to recognize that your journey was never random. And as this understanding settles inside you, the collapse no longer feels like something that happened to you. It begins to feel like something that carried you here. There is a moment in every deep emotional awakening where silence becomes louder than confusion. Not because everything is suddenly answered, but because your inner world is finally quiet enough to hear what was always there beneath the noise. And in that silence, a realization begins to rise. Not as an idea, not as imagination, but as something that feels strangely familiar, like remembering something you were never taught, but always knew. This is the twin flame reveal stage. And it does not arrive like a dramatic announcement. It arrives like recognition. You are no longer searching, you are beginning to recognize. In earlier stages, your energy was directed outward. Searching, wondering, analyzing, trying to understand the meaning behind emotional experiences. But now, something fundamental changes. The searching stops feeling necessary, not because you have all the answers, but because the need to chase answers begins to dissolve. And in that absence of chasing, recognition becomes possible. You start to feel that certain emotional experiences were not random. Certain connections were not accidental. Certain emotional patterns were pointing towards something deeper all along. Not something new, but something that was always aligned beneath the surface. The idea of the twin flame is not about fantasy, it is about emotional resonance. At this stage, something important becomes clear. The twin flame concept is not about idealized romance. It is about emotional mirroring. It is about encountering someone who reflects your internal world so accurately that it forces emotional awareness. Not comfort, awareness. And awareness often begins with discomfort. Because when someone reflects your emotional depth back to you, it reveals where you are open, where you are closed, where you overextend, where you withdraw, where you attach too quickly, where you fear abandonment. This reflection is not always gentle, but it is precise. And precision is what creates transformation. Why the emotional collapse was necessary for recognition. You cannot recognize alignment while your emotional system is overloaded. Because overload distorts perception. You mistake intensity for connection. You mistake anxiety for meaning. You mistake attachment for destiny. You mistake longing for truth. But when emotional collapse happens, something essential is removed. Distortion. And in the absence of distortion, perception becomes clearer. Not perfect, but clearer. And clarity is what allows recognition to occur without confusion. The connection was never gone, it was unseeable. One of the most difficult truths in this stage is understanding timing. Because from the human perspective, it feels like it wasn't there and now it might be. But from a deeper emotional perspective, something different is happening. It was always there, but it could not be fully perceived until your emotional system stabilized. Not because the connection changed, but because your capacity to recognize it changed. And capacity is not intellectual. It is emotional. Why separation was part of recognition, not rejection. Separation is often interpreted as ending. But in this process, separation serves a different function. It creates space for emotional recalibration. Without separation, emotional patterns remain entangled. Attachment stays mixed with fear. Desire stays mixed with uncertainty. Connection stays mixed with instability. But separation forces clarity. It removes immediate emotional interference. And what remains after interference is reduced is something quieter. More stable. More observable. More real. And in that clarity, recognition becomes possible without emotional distortion. The shift from emotional intensity to emotional understanding. Earlier in the journey, intensity was the dominant experience. Strong feelings, strong reactions, strong confusion, strong longing. But intensity does not always mean truth. It often means unresolved emotional energy. In this stage, intensity begins to shift. Not disappear, but reorganize. And what replaces it is something more grounded. Understanding. Not mental understanding alone, but emotional understanding. A sense that what you experienced was not random, not meaningless, and not disconnected from your inner evolution. Even if you cannot fully explain it, you begin to feel its structure. The recognition is internal before it becomes external. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this stage is timing between inner and outer reality. People expect recognition to happen externally first. A message, a reunion, a confirmation, a visible sign. But in reality, recognition begins internally. It begins as a shift in perception. A moment where your emotional system no longer reacts the same way to past confusion. Where memories feel reorganized rather than painful. where certain emotional experiences start to feel like part of a larger pattern rather than isolated events. And once internal recognition stabilizes, external alignment becomes more coherent. Not because you force it, but because you are no longer projecting distortion into it. Why this connection feels different from anything before. At this stage, you begin to notice a key difference. This connection does not feel like obsession anymore. It does not feel like emotional chaos. It does not feel like constant questioning. Instead, it feels like something quieter, more stable in its presence within your awareness. Even if nothing external is happening, even if there is distance, even if there is uncertainty, the emotional charge begins to change. And in that change, something new becomes visible. Presence without overwhelm. This is one of the clearest signs of internal integration. You begin to detach from the need for immediate answers. A major shift happens here. You stop needing everything to be resolved instantly. Not because you no longer care, but because your emotional system is no longer driven by urgency. Urgency is replaced by patience. And patience is not waiting. It is stability within uncertainty. This is a key transition in emotional maturity. Because when urgency disappears, clarity has space to form naturally. The twin flame reveal is not about certainty, it is about coherence. It is important to understand this clearly. This stage is not about confirming every detail. It is about coherence. Do your emotional experiences begin to make sense as a unified process? Do your past confusions begin to connect into a larger pattern? Do your emotional reactions begin to feel less chaotic and more structured? If the answer is yes, then recognition is already happening. Not as certainty, but as coherence of experience. Why this stage feels peaceful but not complete. One of the paradoxes of this chapter is emotional tone. There is often a sense of calm emerging, but not full resolution. This is because you are between two states, the end of confusion and the beginning of integration. You are no longer lost in emotional chaos, but you are not yet fully stabilized in the new understanding. And that in-between space feels like quiet awareness. Not excitement, not fear, but observation. The twin flame reveal is not a moment of external confirmation. It is a moment of internal recognition becoming stable enough to trust itself. And when that happens, something profound shifts inside you. You no longer interpret your past emotional collapse as meaningless. You begin to see it as part of a structured unfolding. Not random loss, not emotional failure, but a process that removed distortion so clarity could finally emerge. And in that clarity, you stop searching for proof, because recognition is no longer something you are chasing. It is something you are beginning to feel as part of your own awareness. There is a moment in this journey where you stop wondering if something is happening, because you can feel that something already has. Not in a dramatic way, not in a sudden revelation, not in a single emotional breakthrough, but in a steady, undeniable shift in how your inner world behaves. This is the stage where the awakening signal stops being subtle and starts becoming your new normal. You are no longer processing the experience, you are living from a new state. Earlier in the journey, everything felt like processing. Processing emotions, processing memories, processing confusion, processing loss, processing meaning. Your inner world was constantly active, trying to organize what was happening. But now, something fundamental changes. You are no longer actively processing everything. Instead, you begin to exist in a new emotional baseline. And from that baseline, everything looks different. Not because the world changed, but because your perception did. The emotional spikes begin to lose their authority. One of the clearest signs of this stage is the weakening of emotional spikes. Things that once triggered strong reactions no longer hold the same power. A memory appears, but does not pull you into a spiral. A name surfaces, but does not destabilize your mood. A past emotion returns, but fades faster than before. It is not suppression. It is not avoidance. It is reduced emotional charge. And reduced charge means your system is no longer over-identifying with emotional input. You are beginning to observe instead of absorb. And that changes everything. Your nervous system begins to stabilize without effort. One of the most important shifts in this chapter is physiological, not just emotional. Your nervous system starts to settle. Not because life becomes perfect, but because internal reactivity decreases. You notice longer periods of calm without forcing it, less internal urgency to figure things out, reduced emotional hypervigilance, a sense of groundedness even during uncertainty. This is not relaxation in the ordinary sense. It is regulation. Your system is no longer in constant emotional defense mode, and that creates a completely different internal experience of life. The mind stops trying to solve everything. Before this stage, your mind was constantly active, trying to decode emotional meaning, trying to understand timing, trying to explain separation, trying to find patterns in confusion. But now something softens. The need to solve begins to fade. Not because answers appear, but because the urgency for answers dissolves. And in that space, something unexpected emerges. Acceptance without resignation. You are no longer resisting uncertainty. You are no longer fighting emotional ambiguity. You are simply allowing experience to be what it is. And that is a major shift in consciousness. Synchronicity becomes quieter, but more meaningful. Earlier in the journey, synchronicity often feels intense. Repeated signs. Emotional spikes triggered by patterns. Overanalysis of meaning. But in this stage, synchronicity changes form. It becomes quieter, less dramatic, more integrated into everyday life. You notice patterns, but you do not chase them. You experience resonance, but you do not obsess over it. You feel alignment, but you do not force interpretation. And because of that, synchronicity becomes more stable as an experience rather than a trigger for emotional instability. It becomes something you live with, not something you react to. You begin to trust your emotional state without external validation. One of the deepest changes in this chapter is internal trust. You no longer need external confirmation to validate how you feel. You stop asking, is this real? Am I imagining this? Does this mean something? What should I do next? Instead, something quieter develops. I can feel this, and that is enough for now. This does not mean you stop thinking. It means you stop outsourcing emotional authority. And this is where emotional independence begins to stabilize. The past no longer feels like a puzzle to solve. In earlier stages, the past felt unfinished. Every memory carried emotional weight. Every connection felt like it needed explanation. Every ending felt like an unresolved equation. But now, the relationship with the past changes. Not because everything is understood, but because everything is integrated at an emotional level. You begin to see your past as part of a process rather than a mystery. And that removes pressure from the present moment. Because you are no longer trying to fix what already shaped you. Your emotional identity becomes less reactive and more observant. Another major shift in this stage is identity-based. You are no longer defined by emotional reactions. Instead, you begin to observe them. A feeling arises, but you are not consumed by it. A memory surfaces, but you are not pulled into it. A thought appears, but it does not control your emotional direction. This does not happen through force. It happens naturally as emotional intensity decreases and awareness increases. And in that space, identity begins to shift from reaction to observation. From emotional involvement to emotional awareness. You begin to experience quiet clarity instead of emotional intensity. Clarity in earlier stages often came with emotional turbulence. You would suddenly realize something, but it would be accompanied by emotional overload. Now clarity becomes different. It is quieter, more stable, less dramatic. It arrives without forcing attention. And because it is not mixed with emotional chaos, it is easier to integrate. This is one of the most important markers of stabilization, because clarity without intensity is sustainable awareness. The twin flame theme becomes less obsessive and more integrated. At this stage, something interesting happens with the core narrative of your journey. The twin flame idea is no longer something you chase mentally. It becomes part of your internal understanding of emotional evolution. Not as obsession, not as expectation, but as context. You no longer ask when or how. Instead, the idea becomes part of a larger emotional framework. Understanding connection, understanding timing, understanding alignment, understanding emotional readiness. And because of this shift, emotional pressure around the concept dissolves. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer defines your emotional state. You are no longer in transformation, you are beginning stabilization. This is one of the most important realizations in this chapter. You are no longer in the peak of emotional transformation. You are entering stabilization. This does not mean everything is complete. It means the most chaotic phase is behind you. The system is no longer breaking down. It is reorganizing into a stable structure. And stabilization feels different from transformation. It feels quieter, more grounded, less dramatic, but more real. The awakening signal is no longer something you occasionally notice. It becomes the background state of your awareness. Not loud, not overwhelming, but consistent. And as this consistency grows, something profound happens inside you. You stop interpreting your emotional journey as chaos and begin experiencing it as evolution. Not perfect, not linear, but deeply structured beneath the surface. And in that realization, a new phase quietly begins. One where awareness is no longer emerging, but already present. If you've stayed with this message until now, then there is something you need to hear. The emotional collapse was never only about you. Yes, you were the one carrying the weight. Yes, you were the one questioning everything. Yes, you were the one who felt abandoned, misunderstood, and spiritually exhausted. But if this is truly a twin flame journey, then transformation does not happen on only one side. It happens on both. Not at the same speed. Not in the same way. Not even at the same time. But eventually, the energy reaches both souls. And when it does, something remarkable begins to happen. The one who once ran from emotion begins to feel everything they spent years trying to escape. The one who avoided vulnerability begins to discover that no amount of distraction can silence what is waking up inside. Because awakening cannot be postponed forever. Sooner or later, the heart demands honesty. And when that moment arrives, his emotional collapse begins. The runner eventually runs out of places to hide. People often imagine awakening as a peaceful spiritual experience. But for the one who has spent years suppressing emotion, awakening feels nothing like peace in the beginning. It feels like pressure. Imagine someone who has built emotional walls for years. Every disappointment was hidden. Every fear was buried. Every vulnerable feeling was locked away behind work, responsibilities, entertainment, relationships, or constant movement. Those walls may appear strong from the outside, but walls require constant energy to maintain. Eventually, they crack. Not because the person suddenly becomes weak, but because truth becomes stronger than resistance. This is why many awakenings begin with emotional collapse. The heart finally becomes louder than the ego. He starts noticing what he ignored before. One of the earliest signs of awakening is subtle. Nothing dramatic happens overnight. Instead, ordinary moments begin carrying extraordinary emotional weight. A familiar song suddenly reminds him of someone he has not allowed himself to think about. A quiet evening feels strangely empty despite being surrounded by distractions. A random memory surfaces while driving, working, or sitting alone. He tells himself it means nothing. He pushes it away. But it returns. Again. And again. Not because someone is forcing those memories into his mind, but because emotional truth always rises when the mind becomes quiet enough to hear it. The feelings he avoided are no longer willing to stay buried. The life that once distracted him no longer feels satisfying. This stage often surprises people. From the outside, everything may look exactly the same. He still goes to work. He still talks to friends. He still follows his daily routine. But inside, something feels different. The accomplishments that once brought excitement begin to feel temporary. The distractions lose their effectiveness. Conversations feel shallow. Achievements feel incomplete. Even moments of happiness carry an unexplainable sense that something important is missing. Not because his life has become worse, but because external success can no longer cover internal emptiness. For the first time, he begins asking questions instead of avoiding them. Regret begins replacing certainty. Earlier in his journey, it was easy to believe he had made the right choices. Leaving felt logical. Avoiding emotional depth felt safer. Keeping distance seemed necessary. But awakening changes perspective. Suddenly, memories are no longer viewed through the lens of fear. They are viewed through the lens of honesty. And honesty can be uncomfortable. He begins remembering conversations differently. Moments where someone offered genuine love. Moments where fear disguised itself as independence. Moments where pride spoke louder than vulnerability. This does not happen to punish him. It happens because awareness removes distortion. The same memories remain. Only the understanding changes. His emotional defenses stop working. For years, logic may have controlled every emotional decision. If I stay busy, I'll forget. If I move on, these feelings will disappear. If I don't think about it, eventually it won't matter. These strategies often work, until awakening begins. Then something unexpected happens. The mind keeps producing logical explanations, but the heart stops believing them. He can explain everything intellectually, yet emotionally, nothing feels resolved. The defenses that once protected him become transparent. He begins seeing through his own excuses. And that realization can be overwhelming, because it means he can no longer hide from himself. Silence becomes impossible to ignore. There is a kind of silence that arrives during awakening. Not the silence between two people. The silence inside. The silence that appears after distractions lose their power. The silence where uncomfortable questions begin appearing. What am I actually afraid of? What have I been running from? What if the connection I dismissed was more important than I realized? These questions rarely arrive all at once. They come gradually, patiently, repeatedly, until avoiding them requires more energy than answering them. And that is often the turning point. His emotional world begins reorganizing itself. Awakening is not simply remembering someone. It is remembering himself. The version of himself that existed before fear became his primary guide. Before disappointment convinced him vulnerability was dangerous. Before emotional survival became emotional identity. As this process unfolds, priorities begin changing. He becomes less interested in appearances, less interested in proving himself, less interested in winning, and more interested in authenticity. Not because someone tells him to change, but because pretending becomes exhausting. The emotional collapse strips away everything artificial. What remains is someone becoming emotionally honest for the first time in years. You may feel the shift before you ever see it. Many people expect awakening to be confirmed by external events. A phone call, a message, a reunion, an apology. Sometimes those things happen. Sometimes they do not happen immediately. But internal shifts often happen long before external actions. You may notice your own emotional pressure decreasing without understanding why. You may suddenly stop feeling the desperate need to chase answers. You may experience an unexpected sense of peace. Not because circumstances changed overnight, but because the energetic dynamic between both souls is beginning to rebalance. When one person stops resisting emotional truth, the entire connection changes frequency, whether you see it immediately or not. Real awakening produces humility. One of the greatest misconceptions about awakening is that it creates certainty. In reality, it creates humility. A truly awakening person becomes less defensive, less reactive, more willing to admit mistakes, more willing to listen, more willing to feel. Because awakening is not about becoming spiritually superior. It is about becoming emotionally honest. The ego wants to be right. The awakened heart wants to be real. And those are two very different paths. Do not interrupt your own healing by trying to measure his. Here is where many people lose the peace they have worked so hard to build. The moment they begin feeling better, they immediately ask, "Has he awakened yet? Is he thinking about me? When will he reach out?" Those questions seem harmless, but they quietly pull your attention back into external dependence. Remember what this journey has been teaching you from the beginning. Your peace cannot depend on another person's timeline. His awakening belongs to his path. Yours belongs to yours. If your emotional stability disappears every time you wonder what he is doing, then your healing is asking for one more layer of freedom. Because genuine alignment is never built on constant emotional monitoring. It is built on trust. Trust in yourself. Trust in your growth. Trust that what is truly meant to unfold does not require fear to sustain it. Perhaps the greatest sign that awakening is real is not that someone suddenly returns. It is that both souls begin living from greater emotional truth. One learns how to stop chasing. The other learns how to stop running. One discovers peace without needing constant reassurance. The other discovers that avoiding love never created freedom, it only delayed healing. And somewhere between those two transformations, the connection itself changes. Not because destiny forces two people together, but because emotional honesty creates a space where authentic connection can finally exist. Whether that connection unfolds tomorrow, months from now, or in ways neither of you expected, remember this. The emotional collapse was never the end of the story. It was the moment the illusion finally broke. So awakening could begin. If you have listened to this message from the very beginning, then take a moment before you continue with your day. Not to analyze, not to search for another sign, not to wonder whether every detail matches your own story. Just pause. Because whether you realized it or not, something has already shifted inside you. Perhaps it was only one sentence. Perhaps it was one realization that refused to leave your mind. Or perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, you stopped seeing your emotional collapse as evidence that something was wrong with you. And instead, you began to wonder if it had been guiding you somewhere all along. If that is true, then this final chapter is not about giving you more information. It is about asking you one simple question. What will you choose now? Every awakening eventually becomes a choice. Many people believe awakening simply happens to them. But that is only half the truth. The awakening itself may arrive unexpectedly. The emotional collapse may come without permission. The old life may begin falling apart before you understand why. But what happens afterward? That becomes your choice. You can spend years trying to rebuild the version of yourself that already dissolved. Or, you can begin building the version that the collapse was preparing you to become. Both paths are available. Only one leads forward. The greatest temptation is returning to what feels familiar. After every emotional transformation comes one final test. Not a test from the universe. Not a punishment. A test created by your own nervous system. Because the human mind naturally seeks familiarity. Even painful familiarity can feel safer than healthy uncertainty. That is why people often return to relationships that drain them. They repeat conversations that never changed. They reopen emotional doors that were already closed. Not because those places nourish them, but because they recognize them. Familiarity is comforting. But familiarity is not always alignment. The collapse happened because your soul was asking for something deeper than comfort. It was asking for truth. You now know the difference between longing and alignment. Earlier in your journey, those two feelings probably seemed identical. If you longed for someone deeply, it felt like destiny. If the emotions were overwhelming, it felt meaningful. If letting go felt impossible, it felt like proof that the connection was special. But now, you have learned something that changes everything. Longing is not always guidance. Sometimes longing is simply unfinished emotional energy. Alignment feels different. It does not require constant fear. It does not require endless uncertainty. It does not require sacrificing your peace just to maintain hope. Real alignment allows you to breathe. Even while you are waiting. Even while you do not know every answer. You were never asked to abandon yourself for love. Think about that for a moment. How many times did you believe love required you to ignore your intuition? How many times did you silence your needs to preserve a connection? How many times did you convince yourself that if you loved hard enough, waited long enough, understood deeply enough, everything would eventually work out? But love that asks you to disappear is not teaching love. It is teaching self-abandonment. The emotional collapse interrupted that pattern. Not because your heart was wrong, but because your heart deserved better than surviving on emotional uncertainty. Your greatest spiritual gift may be your emotional honesty. For so long, you may have viewed your sensitivity as a weakness. Perhaps people told you that you cared too much, felt too deeply, thought too intensely, loved too openly. But what if those qualities were never the problem? What if the problem was placing those gifts in environments that could not receive them? A flower does not become defective because it was planted in dry soil. It simply needs the right conditions to grow. In the same way, your emotional depth was never something to hide. It simply needed relationships, environments, and choices capable of honoring it. And now you know the difference. The future is not asking you to predict it. Many people watching this video still want one final answer. Will we reunite? When will everything happen? Is he awakening now? Those questions are understandable. But notice what they all have in common. They focus on controlling tomorrow. Your awakening has been teaching something very different. It has been teaching presence. Because your real power has never existed in predicting the future. It exists in becoming the kind of person who can meet the future without abandoning themselves. That is a far greater gift than certainty. The timeline changes when you change. One of the most beautiful truths of emotional transformation is this. You are not waiting for life to begin. You are participating in creating it. Every boundary you honor changes your future. Every moment of self-respect changes your future. Every decision to choose peace over emotional chaos changes your future. Transformation does not arrive all at once. It is built through ordinary choices repeated consistently. And eventually, those ordinary choices become an extraordinary life. You are no longer the person who started this journey. Think back to the beginning of this message. Remember the person who believed the collapse meant failure. The person who questioned every emotion. The person who carried unanswered questions like heavy stones. That version of you may still exist in memory. But it does not have to remain your identity. Because somewhere during this journey, you became someone who understands that emotional pain can also be a teacher. That endings can become preparation. That silence can become clarity. That collapse can become awakening. Not because suffering is beautiful, but because healing transforms the meaning of suffering. Your story is still being written. One of the greatest mistakes people make is believing they already know how their story ends. But life has surprised you before. It can surprise you again. People change. Circumstances change. Understanding changes. Most importantly, you change. Do not close the book while you are still living the chapter. The pages ahead have not been written yet. Leave room for grace. Leave room for unexpected healing. Leave room for possibilities that your current perspective cannot yet imagine. This community exists because none of us walk alone. If today's message spoke to something deep inside your heart, remember this. There are thousands of people around the world who have experienced seasons that felt just as confusing. People who questioned themselves. People who felt emotionally lost. People who wondered if anyone could possibly understand what they were carrying. And many of them discovered that healing became easier the moment they stopped pretending they had to do it alone. Sometimes the greatest reminder that you are moving forward is realizing someone else understands the road you have been walking. That is why this community matters. Not because everyone shares the exact same story, but because everyone understands what emotional transformation feels like. Your declaration begins now. Before this video ends, I want to invite you to make a conscious choice. Not for me. Not for anyone else. For yourself. If you are ready to release the version of yourself that believed emotional collapse was the end. If you are ready to welcome the version of yourself that understands it was the beginning. Then let this be your declaration. Write these words in the comments. I choose my new timeline. Not as magic. Not as a guarantee. But as a reminder. A reminder that today, you are choosing growth instead of fear. Truth instead of illusion. Peace instead of emotional survival. And if this message resonated with your heart, subscribe to the channel and join this growing community of people committed to emotional healing, spiritual awareness, and authentic transformation. Share this video with someone who may be standing in the middle of their own emotional collapse, believing they are broken. They may not need advice. They may simply need hope. And remember this above everything else. The darkest moment of your emotional collapse was never the end of your journey. It was the doorway. The doorway to greater awareness, greater freedom, greater love, and the version of yourself you have been searching for all along. Your awakening did not begin when everything became easy. It began the moment you found the courage to keep walking even when everything inside you felt like it was falling apart. That courage brought you here, and it will carry you into everything that comes next.